Hi, my name's Andrew Keane. I'm a Silicon Valley-based entrepreneur and broadcaster and writer. 3 or 4 years ago, I wrote a book called How to Fix the Future, which addressed many of the problems associated with our winner-take-all digital economy. A digital economy that is undermining innovation in technology, creating monopolies, and in many ways corroding our culture. One of the projects that grew out of this book, How to Fix the Future, is a series of broadcasts that I started a couple of years ago called How to Fix Democracy. These broadcasts have also resulted in a documentary feature film, which came out earlier this year called How to Fix Democracy. Democracy and the internet are, of course, intimately bound up with one another. It's no coincidence that the crisis of our democracy, the crisis of attention, of radicalism, a crisis of truth, a crisis of echo chamber culture in which nobody seems to be able to talk to one another, is bound up in our crisis of democracy. It's no coincidence that the rise of intolerant authoritarianism, particularly the authoritarianism represented by people like Donald Trump and Orban in Hungary, and the Brexit movement in the UK, and Putin and Putinism in Russia, has very much ridden off the internet. Donald Trump, for example, is the first true internet president, given his brilliant leverage utilization of the Twitter platform. And ironically enough, even though he was elected democratically, he uses Twitter and many other digital platforms to undermine democracy. So the crisis of democracy in the West, in democratic cultures, whether that's the UK or the US or Hungary, Turkey, Poland, Italy, is very much bound up in the digital revolution. How to fix democracy, then, is very much a question which is inseparable from how to fix the internet. But it's not just the internet which is undermining democracy. Even if the internet hadn't been invented by Tim Berners-Lee, or at least the World Wide Web in 1989, we would still have a crisis of democracy in the West. Alongside the internet, we also have a crisis of democracy bound up in the winner-take-all nature of capitalism. Over the last 20 years, our economies have increasingly become the architecture of a winner-take-all economics. It's not just the Googles and the Facebooks and the Apples and the Amazons of the world, but every sector is dominated increasingly by winner-take-all economics. This has resulted in the decimation of the traditional middle class, the backbone of democratic societies over the last 200 years. And the self-evident appearance of a chasm between a tiny ruling class, who often don't acknowledge themselves as a ruling class, a tiny ruling class of globalist elites who are based in towns like London and New York and San Francisco and Paris and indeed Santiago in Chile. And an underclass, we used to call them, or Marx called them, the working class, the proletariat. But increasingly what we might think of as this class is the precariat, a class increasingly without full-time labor, who are being driven down and down within an economy that takes no prisoners. This chasm between the new rich, and it's not just the 1%, we might think of it as the 10%, a globalist 10%, and the rest of society, is also contributing to a profound undermining of democracy. The problem is that people don't believe in democracy anymore. The problem is that the underclass, the people who have been left out of 21st century capitalism, are rebelling not only against the capitalist system, but against democracy itself. Whether we approve of their politics, the reality is that they are flocking to the Orbans and the Trumps and the Erdogans of the world because they feel left out. So their faith in democracy has been shaken. And they are the ones, indeed, often voting for these new anti-democratic authoritarian parties. So how to fix democracy is really not just a question of how to fix the internet, but how to fix capitalism. These are big questions, questions that can't be fixed overnight. In my book, How to Fix the Future, I focus on 3 areas where fixing the future needs to be addressed. The first is innovation, the second is regulation, the third is education. All these themes are very much bound up in the creation of better citizens, and the solutions to fixing the future through innovation and regulation and education in the creation of better citizens, which I address in my book, is also self-evidently applicable for fixing democracy. To fix democracy, then, we need to regulate, we need to innovate, and we need to educate. All these things, if done appropriately, will result in better citizens. And the challenge, of course, is building a coherent, resilient citizenship in a 21st century in which the consequences of instability, whether they come from COVID or from the nature, the winner-take-all nature of global capitalism, or through the increasingly destabilizing implications of digital technology, need to be addressed now. If we don't address them now, then the future of democracy may indeed be dire. It's quite possible, but by the end of the 21st century, if we don't address these issues, democracy won't exist anywhere. Regulation is really important. In the United States, people are deeply fearful for cultural and historical reasons of regulation. But the only way to support democracy is to regulate. Doesn't mean that regulation is the only solution, but it does mean that we need to rethink the nature of democracy in an unregulated age. Let me take 2 areas in particular when it comes to regulation. We need to address capitalism. We need to address the inequalities that capitalism is created in our society in order to protect democracy. Now, I'm not arguing in favor of some sort of 20th century style, Stalinist or even socialist solution in which the free market is done away with a state-controlled economy. But clearly, the unregulated nature of capitalism in the 2020s is inadequate if we are indeed to save democracy. We need then to address, when it comes to regulation and protecting democracy, we need to increase taxes on the rich. We need to make sure that our societies are much more inclusive when it comes to state policy. We need to invest in infrastructure, and above all else, we need to make sure that every citizen has an opportunity to make something of themselves, an opportunity to realize themselves, an opportunity for their own personal agency. Agency is key. It's essential to democracy. When democracy replaced the aristocratic systems of the Middle Ages, it was premised on the ideal of individualism, that individuals should be free to make something of themselves, to escape their birth, their ethnicity, to escape whatever good or bad luck they happen to be born into. At the moment, we live, particularly in the West, in an increasingly aristocratic system. If you're born into privilege, particularly in the United States, it's almost inevitable that you will end your life privileged by going to expensive universities, by benefiting from the informal or formal networks of your culture. And the reverse is true too. If you're born into underprivileged or unprivileged worlds, in the inner city, in declining areas in the Midwest in the United States, for example, the chances are you won't be able to escape. So we need more regulation. We need to flatten the playing field. We also need regulation when it comes to the information economy. We need regulation in controlling the winner-take-all nature of big Silicon Valley companies like Google and Facebook and Amazon and Apple, because this is the only way to protect truth. Truth has been undermined by social media, and we need much more regulation and accountability when it comes to platforms like Facebook. But regulation on its own won't work. We also need innovation. We need to rethink democracy in the 21st century. In my series, How to Fix Democracy, we focused on some very innovative attempts to rethink democracy in a digital age. This involves much more direct involvement of citizens. It involves digital voting, and indeed I spent a lot of time in my book, How to Fix the Future in Estonia, the first real digital democracy. But it's not just digital that needs to be innovated. Another innovative model that I've been focusing on in my How to Fix Democracy series is citizen assemblies, attempts in countries like Ireland and Belgium and Canada to engage people much more aggressively and actively in the policy decision-making process. Ironically enough, this is something that's been borrowed from Athenian democracy. This is something that's essential if we're to make democracy more engaging and more exciting and more immediate, more legitimate in the eyes of people. When we think about all these things, though, when it comes to both regulation and innovation, the thing that's really essential in terms of developing a more coherent, active, and positive citizenship in the 21st century is education. Citizenship requires a degree of education which we seem to have lost in the early part of the 21st century. Yes, of course, it's all very well to go on Facebook or Twitter or YouTube to enjoy oneself. But it's no coincidence that the increasing intoxication we have with user-generated content has resulted in a political and cultural amnesia when it comes to our traditions and institutions. I warned about this 20 years ago in my book, Cult of the Amateur, which suggested that when we only focus on ourselves and our own voices, we forget about the collective interests of society and we lose touch with history. Education, then, is central. Education is required if we are indeed to fix democracy. Ultimately, all this comes down to citizenship. The point of innovation, the point of regulation, the point of education in 2020 and 2021 and the 2020s is to build more cohesive and resilient citizens. That's the crisis of democracy. Perhaps it's because most of us think of ourselves as consumers rather than citizens. Citizenship is the thing that we need to rescue. This was the essential foundations of democracy from its birth in 5th century BC Athens through the 18th and 19th centuries in England and America, which represent the foundations of a modern democracy. We need to rediscover the excitement of citizenship, the engagement. It doesn't have to be an all-consuming activity. Most of us have lives which are too busy to focus exclusively on citizenship. But when democracy simply becomes a task, a thing that's bothersome, something that we have to vote on every 2 or 4 years, we lose touch with our meaning as citizens. We lose touch with our fellow citizens, and above all else, we lose touch with the issues that define us as citizens. So whether it comes to regulation, innovation, or education, the challenge, the way to fix democracy in the 21st century is by building stronger, better citizens.